Thank you everyone for joining us for this webinar in which Toronto will share information about their progress to date in implementing their own locally developed service triage assessment and referral support, or STARS, tools and processes. This is the 5th webinar actually that Toronto has presented on with CAEH to share their local work. And in those previous webinars, they mentioned their STARS tools, and there was so much interesting questions about this work that they kindly agreed to present today specifically on this topic. And I'll also note that they did provide a short presentation on STARS during the November CAEH 21 virtual conference on ending homelessness. And this presentation today, though, will be more fulsome and will really bring us up to date on where they're at now. My name is Marie Morrison, and I'm the Director of Built for Zero Canada with the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, and I am your host for today's webinar. Our presenters today include Alison Koistra, who is a queer Dutch and Russian Mennonite settler who lives in Toronto with her wife and 2 children. She is a policy development officer with the City of Toronto's Coordinated Access Team in the Shelter Support and Housing Administration area. Her role focuses on the development and continuous improvement of Toronto's Common Assessment Tool. Stephanie Doucette is Algonquin from Wolf Lake First Nations in Chippewa, Quebec. She is the current Indigenous Program Coordinator with the Aboriginal Labour Force Development Circle. Her role works in partnership with the City of Toronto Shelter Support and Housing Administration to ensure coordinated access is responsive to Indigenous communities, Indigenous clients, and Indigenous organizations. So very, very happy to have both of you here with us today. We will begin with a land acknowledgement. I invite you to put your own land acknowledgement in the chat. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. I am located in Kitchener, Ontario, which is situated on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Neutral peoples, whose presence and stewardship of these lands continues to this day. And I see others are putting theirs in the chat as well. And I wanted to give an opportunity if our presenters wanted to do a land acknowledgement.
I'm so sorry. I'm still just trying to figure out logistics with my video. I'm sorry. I don't know.
No,
maybe
no,
Steph Malker
great.
from my
I'll let
team
you
could
put
do
it
or...
into the chat if it makes sense at some point. I just
okay. Yes, thank you for that.
That really works. Thanks so much, Marie.
Yeah, sounds great. All right. This webinar is being brought to you today from the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, which leads a national movement of individuals, organizations, and communities working together to end homelessness in Canada. It includes the 6 key initiatives that you can see listed here. And just a bit of housekeeping before we jump into our topic today. Today's webinar is, as always, being recorded. It will be sent out directly within a few days to all those who registered. We'll also be posting it on the Training and Technical Assistance website under webinars and archived webinars, and I'll just show you what that looks like in a moment. You'll see that closed captioning is enabled. If you wish to turn that off, you can do that through your functions. Everyone is muted. You can ask questions through the chat or question function, and we really encourage everyone to use the chat to reflect on or highlight what you're hearing, to share ideas, or to share what's happening in your community. CAEH Training and Technical Assistance website is where you'll find session recordings under Webinar Archive. And while all of the regular series of webinars that had been sponsored by Reaching Home between 2019 and 2022 has now ended, this is where you can continue to find any webinars that CAEH is continuing to offer on a more ad hoc basis. And as you can see, there's a few posted there now. You can find information on Common Assessment on our Built for Zero website under Resources and under Coordinated Access. So you'll see that there, Resources and Coordinated Access. You can find on this page a drop-down of which one of those drop-downs is Common Assessment Tools, right there. And so any past blogs or information we have related to this topic, you can find there. And I wanted to just share a bit of a disclaimer before we get going as it relates to CAEH's current position on Common Assessment Tools. At its core, CAEH promotes community-wide coordination of human-oriented, housing-focused, and data-informed practice focused on ending homelessness. And we encourage communities to consider a number of qualities related to the application of not only tools, but processes related to coordinating intake, triage, matching, prioritization, and referral. And CAEH has been agnostic on common assessment tools, really seeking to provide information about, but not to promote one tool over another. We really encourage communities to develop and or use a tool or suite of tools that works best for them in support of an end to homelessness. And CAEH seeks to support community peer exchange and sharing of practical community-based solutions for ending homelessness through webinars such as this. And just really excited about Toronto's presentation today. They have been very thoughtfully developing STARS tools and processes since at least 2015. And so thank them for being here and really looking forward to hearing from them today. So with no further ado, I will stop sharing my screen. And I think, Stephanie, you're going to share your screen.
Yes, and I can also, sorry, I can't figure out my camera. I do apologize to everybody, but I can do a land acknowledgement to start us off, Marie.
That would be great.
Okay. So I acknowledge that the land that I live and work on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaty signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa nations. And just finally, I always like to, when I do a land acknowledgement, just share that, you know, the Shelter Support and Housing Administration within the city, we have worked together with TASK and other Indigenous partners within the City of Toronto on a collaborative document called the Meeting in the Middle Engagement Strategy and Action Plan that really speaks to the work that we're trying to do to end Indigenous homelessness and address the overrepresentation of people who are Indigenous within our system. And that really speaks to developing a different relationship between our organizations and advancing the work of reconciliation in many practical ways. And in many ways, the work that Stephanie and I are going to co-present today is an outgrowth of that, those commitments and those partnerships and relationships that are being built. So just wanted to start by saying that. And then over to you, Stephanie.
Thanks so much, Allison. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm just going to share my screen here. And is this okay?
I think we're seeing your presentation mode, so you might just need to switch the setting.
How's that?
There you go. Yep.
Okay, great. Again, thank you for joining us. So we're going to give you a progress update on Toronto's STARS service triage, assessment, and referral support tool and processes. So again, I'm Stephanie Doucette, and this is my coworker, Allison Koistra.
Hello.
So this presentation is going to focus on two different ideas. We're here today to present our STARS Common Assessment Tool, but we don't want to focus so much on the words on the paper. We want to give you the context for our processes. Common assessments tools don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in the context of colonialism and systemic racism. Research has shown that common assessment tools can reproduce systemic biases in their scores. Research has also shown that the relationship between the person administering the assessment and the person responding has a significant impact on the information that is shared. So given all of this, what's important is how the system works. The tool exists to support and facilitate the system. We called this presentation a progress update because we're not quite done yet. We're still in the process of implementing our tool. So we're not here today to present a finished product that has been tested and evaluated, but we're here to present our best foot forward based on the collaborative conversations we've had with many partners to date. Like I mentioned, the process is more important than the paper itself. So this means two things. First, the words on the paper are important, but what is much more important is the context for these questions. Who is asking what questions and when? What types of supports do people have access to along the way? After they answer the questions in the tool, what will happen next? So the second piece is the process for designing and developing the system. In Toronto, we have worked with a diverse range of agencies and people to develop our tool, including the Indigenous community entity and Indigenous service providers and community members. So when we work together collaboratively and we build and maintain good relationships, it helps us to ensure that the system remains responsive to all people's needs.
Okay, so the STARS Common Assessment tool that we want to chat with you about today has 3 components. The reason for it having 3 components is based on our research and piloting various versions of this tool over time. It was important for kind of workflow processes within our system and ensuring that people have access to, Stephanie, sorry, you're moving it around. Yeah, that's the slide, thank you. Ensuring that people have access to kind of a progressive engagement approach where, you know, their immediate needs are being met and there's time to build rapport and trust with a worker prior to diving into some of the more sensitive questions. So the 3 components are the intake and triage, the housing checklist, and the supports assessment. And our presentation today is going to focus pretty heavily on the supports assessment piece of it. You want to go to the next slide, Stephanie? So as Stephanie mentioned, this is a progress update. We have the intake and triage and housing checklist components. They've been being piloted for over a year, about a year and a half at 14 shelter sites, and all street outreach programs, sorry, I should say more recently at all street outreach programs in our homelessness sector information management system, which we call SMIS. It's a web-based software that's similar to HIFIS 4. That's what you're more familiar with. We will be launching these 2 modules, these 2 components of our tool to all agencies that are using SMIS on June 28th, 2022. Trainings are currently underway. The third component, the supports assessment, currently exists in a Microsoft Word format. We are launching it in the 3rd quarter of 2022. That's our target, and it will replace our existing housing support screening tool. So we already have just to be clear, we have a tool in place, the HSST, that is currently doing the function of the supports assessment, but we've just done kind of a lot of work to understand you know, what needs to be done to revise that tool and to collaboratively develop a more responsive and you know, but more precise tool for understanding and directing people's, connecting them with supports. And we do plan to build that 3rd component, that supports assessment, into SMIS, but that's going to require a lot of development work. We want to, you know, ensure that it's not duplicating case management processes, et cetera. So that work is underway, that think work is underway, and we plan to launch that sometime in 2023. You can advance. So just a quick note. So what does each of the STARS components include? So for the intake and triage, it's conducted kind of at that moment of intake to a shelter program, or at the moment that a person agrees to case management with a street outreach counselor or a street outreach caseworker. It collects basic information, demographics, and looks at kind of the supports that somebody might request or be interested in, just at a high level, looking at a checklist. And triages support levels in a preliminary way as low, moderate, or high, based on kind of the level of support someone may need to access permanent housing. So the intake and triage, from a coordinated access perspective, we're using this tool to inform our by name list. This is the information collected that leads to what's on our by name list. We use the information collected here for prioritization and for system planning. And at the program level, staff will use this tool to help people with service navigation at a basic level. The next component of our tool, the housing checklist, it identifies if service users have a valid ID, if they have income, if they have, a notice of assessment from the most recent taxation year, active and up-to-date housing applications, and kind of a range of other factors that are critical to pulling together the documentation needed to connect people with housing. And by housing, I mean kind of a wide range, right? Like could be housing in the private market, could be, supportive housing opportunities through the province, could be, RGI housing in public housing and all that kind of thing. So this is part of the case management work that gets done at that component. So the third tool, and I'm just realizing, Stephanie, I don't know if this is clear on others' screens, if you can see kind of the bottom part of the screen, but basically the first two components, the intake and triage and the housing checklist, are done with, or are available to workers who can use it with, anybody who is coming through our doors of a shelter or anybody who's agreeing to case management with a street outreach caseworker. The supports assessment is only done after somebody has been prioritized for a housing opportunity or after somebody has expressed interest in applying for follow-up supports and they've identified that they're moving out into housing. So the supports assessment is done with a smaller component of the people who are touching our system. The focus of this tool is really looking at, kind of the range of existing supports in the person's life and the types of supports where they would request them or there may be gaps. And that's in terms of health or substance use, activities of daily living, communication, other areas of support. And so we use this tool. The referring agency will, complete the tool with a service user. The city staff at our end will review that assessment to make an appropriate match to a follow-up support or supportive housing provider that's offering the level of support that the person requires or maybe particular types of supports that may be required. And then follow-up workers also review that tool from that perspective as a baseline for beginning work with newly housed tenants. So just to be clear kind of about our housing outcomes, so 100% of service users who are entering our system, who are touching our various support services, have access to housing focused case management, meaning they could go to a housing help center. If they're at a shelter, there's housing workers at the shelter. Many drop-ins, multi-service agencies and so forth also have housing focused case management services. Street outreach can provide that service. So no matter where a person touches the system, they have access to housing focused case management. And that could include support to apply for rent geared to income housing or provincially contracted supportive housing or housing allowances if the person just needs some financial support, follow-up supports if that's really the area that the person needs some assistance with, voluntary trusteeships. There's a whole wide range of supports that are available. And then there's this smaller slice here, 5% of all, so these numbers are for 2021. So in 2021, it was about 5% of all service users or about 12% of all chronically homeless service users who were prioritized and matched to housing opportunities, supportive housing opportunities that we as the City of Toronto have contracted and are responsible for placing people in. So that is 1,055 individuals matched to 913 city contracted supportive housing units in 2021. So if you want to advance.
So in our community, we believe that collaborative development is the key to ensuring that our system is responsive to everybody's needs. So in Toronto, we have two community entities. We have the City of Toronto Shelter Support and Housing Administration, and then we have the Indigenous community entity, which is the Aboriginal Labour Force Development Circle. We have two community advisory boards underneath that, and these CABs each have a dedicated subcommittee that meets regularly to assist with coordinated access development work. These committees are made up primarily of executive directors and senior management staff, but throughout the development process of this tool, we have been striking working groups, conducting user research, and engaging with a diverse range of frontline staff, caseworkers, service users, and people with lived experience of homelessness. And we also work very closely with SSHA's Confronting Anti-Black Racism Steering Committee. So through collaborative development, We have designed the STARS tool to work in the following ways. So decentralized assessments integrated within existing case management relationships. We have no numerical score, meaning that a person does not feel they have to be reduced to a number. The prioritization process is separate from the supports assessment and matching. There's no waitlist for supportive housing resources available through coordinated access. We provide real-time matching from the by names list when vacancies become available. It's a living document, so the STARS tool components can be updated to reflect changes as a person's needs change over time. Self-report and transparency. The answers are based on the person's own responses, not the worker's responses. So the result of our collaborative process is a shift from thinking, how can we sort you, to how can we support you? We don't need to place people in boxes, and we recognize that people's needs change over time. We want the system to be responsive, flexible, and person-centered. We want to strengthen the relationships in their web of supports. The tool is designed to center relationship building, trust, and good service in the following ways. We want to provide access. The STARS tool will be administered by a wide range of homelessness servicing sites, including shelters and street outreach, with expansion to additional sites in the future. Integration with existing decentralized case management supports. A service user can easily access supports from a range of service providers operating in different geographical areas. We don't want to ensure reciprocal relationships. The caseworker begins providing supports right away and remains in contact with the service user throughout referral and matching processes. The service user knows how to contact the worker to follow up if need be. Choice and cultural safety. So a service user can choose which service provider they would prefer to receive supports from. For example, an Indigenous service user may choose to receive supports from an Indigenous service provider, or they may choose to work with another service provider, whatever they want. Choice and control. The client doesn't have to answer all of the questions in order to access supports. They give the info they want to give in relation to the supports they feel that they want to receive. And the service user can share as much as they feel comfortable to share. The questions can be completed in one sitting or several sittings. So we're going to focus on the supports assessment today, which is the third component, since that is the tool that covers most of the content that is in other similar tools that are used in other communities. So we have prepared a poster that will be shared with each caseworker using the supports assessment. So both of these posters share information about the content of the tool, a high-level overview of what questions are asked and what the steps are in the process. There are two posters, and one is to be used by Indigenous service providers and the other is for use by mainstream providers. The content in both of these posters is similar, but the one that was prepared for Indigenous service providers highlights the ways that Indigenous worldviews help to shape the tool and can inform the process of using it with a community member. So this is our Indigenous service provider poster to be used within the Indigenous community, and the poster is intended to be put on the wall in an Indigenous caseworker's office. The caseworker is to walk through the poster with a community member before beginning the assessment, just to give them an idea of what's about to happen and what the process is going to look like and what they're going to get out of it. So the idea of the visual is to show the journey of the relationship between the worker and the service user completing the assessment. And the purpose is to look at the assessment as a relationship building tool. And it shows the service user as a whole person, and this is to promote a holistic view of that person. So just walking through this image, the center of the image represents the earth, which is the focus of all of the directions. And traditionally, we would begin here with introductions. The service provider reviews the goals of the assessment and asks for consent to continue on with the assessment. The service provider should return to the center at any point in the journey if there's any questions or they need to clarify their intentions for asking any of the questions in the assessment. The eastern doorway is, as beginnings usually occur in the east, the assessment starts at this doorway. Demographic information and housing history are collected, and the community member shares who they are with the worker. This information will be used to identify eligibility for different programs and put support needs in the context of a person's story. In the southern doorway, the service provider asks about what types of supports the person may need to maintain that long-term housing stability, and this information will be used to connect the person with appropriate services. And we like to give, when we're meeting with the community member, we want to give them a heads up that, you know, in the southern doorway, some of the tougher questions are going to be asked. So they're able to map that out in their mind before beginning, and they can kind of prepare themselves that, okay, I'm going to be asked some personal questions now. So in the western doorway, the service provider explores the formal and informal supports that the person already has in place, and it identifies where there may be gaps. And we also want to ensure that there's no duplication of services, and that's kind of why we're asking for this here. In the northern doorway, this is kind of that reciprocal relationships piece. And this is where the service provider explains to the community member what the next steps are for accessing specific housing and support opportunities, as well as letting them know timelines and how long it may take. And just being really transparent so they know what they're walking away with from that interaction. And the service provider also connects the community member to any immediate supports that they need. So after the assessment, the service provider checks in with the community member to see how they're feeling, and where appropriate, the service provider should support them to access any cultural supports, including sacred medicines, elders, traditional counseling, or healing. And the service provider may be able to offer those supports directly, or they may provide them with a referral for whatever they feel that they need in that moment. And service providers should be aware that after an assessment, community members may feel emotional after disclosing personal information, and they should be prepared to offer appropriate care in that moment.
Okay, I'm just going to see, I just switched computers. So I'm wondering if I can share my screen, and then maybe this will go a little bit more smoothly. Let me try.
In order for Allison to share her screen, Stephanie, you may have to stop sharing yours.
Of course, thank you.
Okay. Let me just share here. And oh my goodness, what a day.
You're doing fine, Allison.
I know, it's just so nerve-wracking when everything goes
I know it is.
haywire, right?
Watching. We all understand the technical challenges. You're doing great.
Yes. All right. Thank you so much for the kind words, Marie. It's very, very kind of you. Okay, so this is a fairly long tool. It's multiple pages, and so I'm not going to, sort of review every question in depth, but I'll review it, and I'll at a high level, and I'll hit the highlights for folks, so you can see what the tool looks like, the basic flow, and kind of the focus and intention of the tool. So again, this is the third component, and as Stephanie highlighted, and I just want to again emphasize the context for usage. So this is typically done by a caseworker who's already familiar with the person. It's within that existing case management relationship. It's done at the point of a unit being offered through one of our city contracted supportive housing opportunities, or at the point that a person is applying for specific follow-up supports. So it's done really, within a few days or a few weeks of that person moving out into housing and connecting with specific types of supports. So that's the context and intention of it, is to understand people's support needs and ensure that they're being connected with the right types of supports as they move out. So keep going. So the tool has 6 components. The first section is administrative information. Then we have a housing history, a menu of services. We look at existing supports. We do a quick kind of sum up at the end of summary and priorities. And then we conclude with a review of levels of support or frequency of support that somebody is looking for. And so these these categories kind of fit in 3 broad buckets. We're looking to understand the person's story and their goals. What's been going on for them recently, what's been happening with their housing, what are they hoping their next stage will look like. And then the next piece we want to understand is the types of supports that a person thinks would be beneficial for them, what will be of assistance. We want to look at any safety concerns that may be going on to ensure that we can address that very quickly. And then we want to also look at, what are the existing supports that are already in the person's life, so that we can kind of balance that against the supports that we may be able to provide, and identify where the gaps are. So the first section is administrative information, and I'll just flag that, right now this tool exists in a Microsoft Word format, so it duplicates some of what we have in SMIS in our web-based software. However, as we build this tool into SMIS, probably a lot of this information will be collected at a different point in time, typically at the intake. For now, it's in our Microsoft Word tool. So we start with some basic information. The person who's doing the assessment, their name, their organization, the person who's responding to the questions, their name, their date of birth, gender, pronouns, that sort of info. We ask 4 demographic questions. One is around Indigenous identity in the Canadian context, so First Nations, Inuit, or Métis. One is around racial identity. We ask if the person has served in the Canadian military or RCMP, and we ask if the person is applying for refugee status in Canada. And these questions help us with service navigation and with connection to specific types of supports. They also help us on the back end once we've done our housing placements, and we want to be accountable for the equity-based targets in our prioritization policy. So we want to ensure that we understand, we have, for example, a 25% allocation to people who are Indigenous. So we want to ensure that we understand if we're meeting that target, and if not, what we can do to adjust. We also, of course, collect contact information. That's pretty straightforward. Household questions. So this is key in terms of housing placements, in terms of the number of the number of bedrooms. We ask if the person has children or other dependents they are planning to live with. So either dependents who are currently in their care, or dependents that they're planning to have in their care again in the future, or no dependents. If the person has other household members, we ask for their name, date of birth, contact information, and so forth. And if the person is 16 years old or older, we do ask for a separate supports assessment to be completed, and that's because we're able to provide separate follow-up supports in some cases for people who have independent needs and goals. So we also check in on accessibility requirements through 2 lenses. One is kind of looking at the person themselves and their accessibility needs, if they're using, for example, a wheelchair or a scooter, if they have a service animal, that kind of thing. And then we also look at, what unit modifications the person may need within their unit. So would they need grab bars or rails? Would they need hardwood floors? Elevator access to their unit or to the laundry room, etc. Just trying to ensure that when they're connected with a housing opportunity, that it's going to be the right match for them. So for housing history, that's our next section. So this is really kind of our most open-ended section, where there's not a lot of checkboxes and there's just a lot of open space for the person to share their story. So we start by asking them to share what their goals and priorities are, other than housing. So the goal of all of this is to get somebody into housing, but what is the person's other kind of priorities or goals, things that are top of mind for them as they're meeting with a case manager. Then we do housing history. So the prompt to the worker and the client is to say, please tell me a little bit about what's been going on over the past few years. How long may you have been experiencing homelessness? Have you been staying in shelters, sleeping outside, staying with friends? Have you spent time incarcerated or in hospitals? We're asking about the last few years so we can understand what's been going on and how we can best support you to maintain your housing in the future. So we start typically with where someone was staying last night, and then we work backwards from there. So here's just a sample. So this is just obviously a fictional person. This is not real data. This is not a real story, but this fictional person named JT is the service user that we're working with. She's currently staying at NCFS Eagle's Nest Youth Transitional Shelter in Toronto. But going back a few years, and I'll tell the story from the bottom up, just because I think that makes more sense in terms of a presentation for you. But so from January 2018 to February 2020, she was living in an apartment in Ajax, which is near Toronto, with her boyfriend. So that was permanent housing that we checked off here. She moved, she and her boyfriend ended up starting to couch surf with friends and family members in Ajax, Hamilton, and Toronto. So that would count as temporary housing. She left her boyfriend to go to an intimate partner violence shelter and was staying there at a shelter in Ajax. So again, that's clicking the shelter box. She returned to her boyfriend and they both moved into an encampment in Toronto. Then they moved to an encampment in the Don Valley together, and she left that encampment when the weather started to get cold, but her boyfriend is still staying there. And now she's at the transitional shelter. So we use this information for a few pieces. One is just to understand kind of, the last few years, what's been going on, the last time that somebody had stable housing, what that looked like for them. We use it to understand kind of that history of involvement with, have there been multiple evictions? Has it been, have the issues been primarily, financial? Have there been challenges with relationships or with conflict resolution pieces that may need to be addressed, or that a follow-up worker may need to provide some support around? And so that's one thing is from a follow-up worker perspective is really like, what are some of the things that might be that have come up in the past and that might present again in the future, and how can we manage some of those risks, working together with the person to discuss those pieces. And then the other reason that we ask for this is, so our current software that I mentioned, Smiths, it only tracks shelter bed nights for us in terms of identifying the length of time someone's been experiencing homelessness. So our workers understand this, city staff understand this tool as a way to look at, shelter bed nights that were outside of Toronto, staying in an encampment, so that would not necessarily show up within our system. Couch surfing, these are different types of homelessness that can affect a person's eligibility in one direction or another, depending on the specific program and funding supports that are provided. So it's really helpful for us to understand this. The next section is just kind of an open box. If there was any information that wasn't, couldn't fit it into this table grid, or that it's really critical for understanding something, just an open box to kind of fill in that gap. And then there's a couple more kind of prompt questions for workers to start to really engage with the person about, when you think about moving to your next home, are there people or places you would like to avoid? Because that can be really critical in terms of identifying neighborhoods. And what is most important to you in moving into your next home? What are some of the things that you're really looking for that will help you stabilize and feel good in your next home? And then please tell me a little bit more about your past experiences with housing. Some of the things that haven't worked so well for you, and then what are some of the things that have worked really well? And really trying to, from a worker perspective, kind of wrap this up on a more positive note. This is the end of the housing history section. So the next section is the menu of services, and this is the part that I'm going to dash through relatively quickly. It's designed to be a series of questions that will help the worker identify what the specific supports that the person is looking for. In some cases, a follow-up worker may be able to provide those supports directly. In other cases, that worker may assist the person to connect with another service or program. So this section, we have housing supports, we have finances, education and employment, we have social and community supports, we have communication and organization, legal and immigration supports, health and wellness, substance use, activities of daily living, safety and housing stability.
And so, yeah, a key point here is that the worker is meant to be conversational and friendly. They don't need to read the words exactly as they're written down. And part of the reason we start with the housing history first as well is to really understand, what kind of has been going on, what are the person's priorities and goals. These are the things that can help shape the way a worker presents the menu of services to an individual to understand, you mentioned that this came up in the past. Is that something that you might like support with in the future, for example? So housing supports includes things like talking through problems with household members or neighbors if they come up, or talking through problems with a landlord, protecting yourself from unit takeover, arranging or revising an arrears repayment plan. There's kind of a range of supports here. Something to highlight is that each section, so each one of these sections ends with no supports needed in this area. So if nothing is checked off here, then the worker needs to check this off to indicate that this section was reviewed, but there's no supports needed. There's an open text box at the end of each section to provide more details on the types of supports requested, and so forth. So these are the different social and community supports: communication and organization, legal and immigration, health and wellness. I'll pause here just to kind of go through this in a little more depth as well. So this is, asking the person if they would like support with, mental health, and then there's some examples provided with a box to specify exactly which type of mental health support the person is looking for. Cognitive health, again, with some examples, again, with a request to specify physical health, a range of pieces there. Spiritual health, connecting to faith groups or cultural or religious healing ceremonies and supports, and please specify. Accessing or using traditional Indigenous medicines, for example, sage, sweetgrass, cedar, and tobacco. And then at the bottom, there's a question around formal diagnosis. So, is the person requesting supports from a place of saying, I'm feeling really depressed, or have they been formally diagnosed with depression? There's also a question around if they would like assistance in accessing formal diagnosis. So I'm just going to scoot through these pieces. The presentation will be put up on the website after, so people can kind of go through this at their leisure. I'll just flag, so the majority of the questions in this tool are really kind of forward-facing, asking people what supports they would like in the future, really trying to stay focused on the future and on goals. But there is one section that asks some very heavy questions about past behaviors, for example, or current threats to a person's well-being. Questions around suicide and threats of domestic violence, overdosing, etc. So this is a very challenging and difficult section. We ask that staff kind of pause if anybody discloses an urgent and immediate safety concern, that they then conduct a safety plan with that individual. It's a separate document. Many agencies will have their own document. We're also working on a safety planning resource that people can draw on as well. The next section is existing supports. And so, as I mentioned, this is really looking at kind of the range of formal or informal supports. Could be a drop-in, cultural center, could be, a therapist, could be a family member, just kind of to understand, you've just shared with us this range of support needs that you have in your life. Are there people who are currently helping you with those areas? Or where are the gaps? Where can we be most useful in connecting you with supports? Summary and priorities. So this is really just wrapping up at the end. At the beginning, you mentioned that these were your priorities. Now that we've kind of reviewed this long list of possible supports you could access, have your priorities shifted? If so, it's just a check-in about that. And then the final section is around levels of support. So looking at the frequency that somebody might need support in different areas. What times of day they might need that support, methods of contact. And then at the end of the session, we just want to check in and see how the person is feeling. We want to make sure that we're validating their emotions, helping them process them, and trying to frame the experience in a positive light. It can be very painful and difficult to answer a lot of these questions, but it's about really keeping the focus on what the next steps are, showing appreciation for the person's time, effort, and openness, providing that clear information. So, there's this housing opportunity, what are the options, what are the timelines for accessing that, connecting people with resources, ensuring the person knows how to contact you, and just kind of saying, it's really important to take solid action after the assessment. The person should feel like they're receiving something in return. They've just shared a lot of information and requested a lot of types of support. So if there's something you can do kind of immediately, if they've talked about needing harm reduction supplies, you can immediately offer that. If they mentioned they need to see a doctor pretty urgently, maybe you can let them know where the closest walk-in clinic is or something along those lines. But it's really important just to kind of ensure that the person is feeling supported in those pieces. Just wary of running out the time here. I'll just flag that Marie mentioned this off the top, but there are some other CAEH webinars that we have done that kind of spell out more details about different components of our system and the processes. So we'll just flag those here. Yeah, and I think that's it.
Thanks so much, Allison and Stephanie. That was, you went through that very thoroughly, but also very quickly. And we do have some questions already in the questions. Encourage others. We'll take questions up till 1 o'clock, and then there's contact information for the folks who presented today if you want to follow up further. So what the first question was, I assume that the responses from clients are self-disclosed. Is there ever any sort of follow-up to confirm, for example, veteran status or a particular health issue, if there's sort of eligibility associated with some of that?
Yeah, I'll speak to that quickly. So short story, no, like we don't do vetting for a lot of that. However, there are, like if the program is very specific to, for example, like you need a formal health diagnosis, then that would, the partner would be following up to ensure that piece. I also have my manager Steph on the call, so if I'm misrepresenting that particular piece of the puzzle, you can maybe drop an answer in the chat, or I don't know, maybe unmute.
That's great. So yes, sort of you do the assessment, and then if there's further follow-up that is needed, it might be the program that they're getting referred to that's doing that. Yeah. Are domestic violence shelters using this tool, or is it just sort of designated homeless shelters?
So again, we actually haven't rolled the tool out yet. We're just in process of getting all our ducks in a row to formally launch. We thought we would be launched by the time we did this webinar, but there's been a few setbacks. So yes, we do have set-asides for the VAW sector, and they do use our current, the housing support screening tool that we've been using for a number of years now. The supports assessment will replace it, and at that point, we will be communicating with the VAW sector and yeah, rolling out to them as well to replace the HSST with the new tool.
And if you could share a bit more about the process to identify which agency is actually going to be the one to complete the assessment. Yeah, sort of who's best connected, or like how does someone go from some of your earlier parts of the process to being sort of connected with who will do the assessment with them?
Do you want to take it, Stephanie?
Yeah, so like we're going to be, yeah, no problem. And just jump in if I'm missing anything. But the client will actually choose where they would like to receive services, and then that service provider will do the referring. And with that, they will use the STARS supports assessment to complete that referral to various housing providers.
Yeah, and so what we do right now is, like with the by name list, like our city staff look at it to identify clients who are eligible and prioritized. And they also have, so for our rapid rehousing program, there's a specific allocations per site. For our PATHS program, it works a bit differently, but kind of long story short, there's a process for determining which service provider to go to next, and in part it's driven by who's eligible and prioritized on the by name list.
Okay. Yeah, so you're sort of narrowing before you're getting very close to offers and getting close to that before you're starting to engage in this level of conversation with a client.
Yes.
Yeah, with the person. We have a question about what training will be available to service providers for the assessment tool. And I would even back that up and say training, I mean, because this is part of a whole process, right? And so just curious about your overall training approach.
I can speak to that from an Indigenous perspective. So we actually recently just had a training for Indigenous service providers, and we had that in person. And we kind of covered the assessment and how to complete an assessment from an Indigenous worldview. And we had a traditional healer with us to help guide that discussion. And so that training is done. And then we're going to be having mainstream trainings over Zoom coming up shortly, but we haven't quite got there yet.
And this question, I was just curious, in your practicing and testing of the tool, how long is it typically taking to work through the process? And recognizing you might not do it all in one go. I mean, it can be done over time, but how long does it take generally?
Yeah, it's been taking about an hour to an hour and a half. So that's in our last round of piloting, that's about where we were clocking in. Yeah, again, we're really encouraging staff to kind of take breaks or do it in chunks, depending on, how the person is feeling about it and what they want to do. Recognizing it can be pretty intense to sit down for a long time, but in some cases, people just want to power through and get it done. So.
Great. Thank you for that answer. And then someone had just said, help contextualize this for me. How many folks are experiencing homelessness in your system?
Well, the number from 2021 was over 19,000. So I don't have a more precise number, but it's somewhere between 19 and 20,000 people in a given year. So that's unique individuals within a given year.
And here is a question. Oh, and Stephanie may have answered it.
Yes, thank you, Stephanie. Yeah, so my manager just shared, Steph Malker just shared a really terrific resource that our team has been working very hard to share. We make our homelessness data public. So you can see kind of month to month, how many individuals are experiencing homelessness. You can filter by chronic homelessness, Indigenous homelessness. You can look at different factors, family homelessness, youth, refugees, I believe as well. Actually, maybe not refugees yet, but anyway, there's a range of factors that you can filter and look at the data and see trends across time. It's a really terrific resource.
Stephanie, thanks for sharing that. Just as we're into our last few moments, and we'll keep taking questions, but I'm just going to launch a poll just for people to be able to give feedback about the webinar today. So we had a question about sharing of tools and training and that sort of thing. And I know people have also asked this before, like, when can you share your tools with us? Is that something that's going to be possible?
Yeah, so I'll just share, we had kind of hoped to share the whole package today. Unfortunately, we've had a bit of a setback with that third component that we focused on, the supports assessment. We are able to share the two components that are already launched in SMIS and that we have trainings that are live right now going on. So that's the intake and triage and the housing checklist. We do hope to share the supports assessment in the near future, but as I said, we've just had a few delays. We want to make sure that we're sharing it with all of our service partners first before kind of going wider with it. But I promise we'll share the first two components, and then we'll share the third component as soon as we can. And in the meantime, the screenshots that I shared in my PowerPoint, you can review those, and that's the full tool. You can take a look.
And I will just note in your presentation, because it comes a little bit further, but you've got all the references that kind of have gone into informing some of the.
Yes, I wouldn't even say all the references, but it's definitely the short list, the highlights, the most influential, perhaps. Yeah.
Great. So someone said, I really like this version of an assets-based assessment. Can you talk about at all about what tool is used for the earlier phase regarding prioritization? So I think you recognize, you said this isn't about prioritization. So what is prioritization?
Yeah, so for our prioritization approach, and maybe my manager can speak more to this, but there was a community-based process where we brought a lot of community partners together to kind of collaborate on setting priorities. We also looked at our street needs assessment from 2021. That's our point in time count, to understand kind of the dynamics, like who's overrepresented within our homelessness system and how can we really start to address that in a meaningful way. So our prioritization policy focuses on chronic homelessness. There's specific allocations for people who are Indigenous, people who are Black, people who are seniors, women, youth, 2S LGBTQ folks, and the specific percentages don't all add up to 100% because we're taking this intersectional approach and this intersectional lens to understand people's different positionalities. But yeah, that's how we're doing our prioritization. So we primarily rely on the demographics that are collected during that intake process to do that, and the length of time experiencing homelessness. Again, primarily we're looking at SMIS bed nights at this point, but we are developing processes so that we can, and we have, I should say, we have workarounds for people who don't have SMIS bed nights, for example, our VAW sector, street outreach and so forth, but we're working to consolidate so that we don't have to have workarounds for different groups, that we can just have them all in one consolidated database with consistent criteria. So that work is still in process as well.
And I realized I wasn't sharing my screen before when I was sort of mentioning and I did want to just, oh my goodness, that is not what I wanted to do. I wanted just the references and
the references, yes.
Yeah, I thought I was sharing my screen and I was like flipping through it, but I will say to that question about at the beginning of the presentation, we mentioned one of the sessions that you folks had done was around paths prioritization. So there's a whole
hour. There's a whole session on it. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, your process there. That's great. All right. Well, I think we are just like a minute before time, and I'm not seeing any other questions right now. But again, we really thank everyone for joining us. We very much thank our presenters. There's contact information there if you're needing to follow up. We look forward to receiving the tools that you are able to share, and maybe we can look to share those out when we put out the presentation, or you may have another way you're wanting people to connect, but we'll make sure we get this information out to folks. Wonderful. So we wish everyone a great rest of your Thursday and the rest of your week. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Take care. Bye.